The Velikovsky Heresies with Laird Scranton. You're listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents and wizards and shamans and sorcerers and everybody else. I saw this mentioned in the Discord that I wasn't naming off all the witches and wizards and everybody else.
Okay.
You know, it's not fair. So, this is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. And we are joined for the first part of this first segment in the studio once again after many months by Snake Wife, Snake Sister Laura.
Hey, Snake Force. I've been growing a baby.
Yeah, and Soul's in here. Say hi.
Hey.
Yeah, so he's in here hanging out too, just for this first part. So we have a couple of announcements. Laura's been working on the hats, so let's talk about that first.
So I'm very excited about it. We've sealed the deal. You can go to the link that Russ is going to put on the site. Click on it, order your Snake Bros hat. 15% is donated to the podcast.
That's right. That's the main part.
That's the main part. So Merry Christmas, Snake Bros.
Yeah,
Merry Christmas.
So by the
That's
time this
awesome.
episode goes up, or right afterwards, basically, we'll post this episode, and then I'll get on the website, and in the SnakeSkins sections, I'll basically add a picture of the hat and a link that takes you to the site of the place that's going to be making them for us, and it'll be on demand. So you can go directly to the site, order one hat or as many as you want or whatever, and they will handle the making, the taking of the payment, and the shipping, and then we will get a cut of that. And this is a local business, so Laura has been working very hard to get this all set up, and we finally got the deal finalized, and everything, all the information is on their website, so I'll be able to link directly to it. But in the future, right, we want to work because they have tons of products.
Yes. Right now, if you're trying to get fancy and get something that's not just the hat, just, contact them and say, I want the logo on blah, whatever you're wanting.
Yeah, so you basically can do that by sending them an email.
But we'll have it worked out better in the future. They're going to keep growing with us, working with us too.
Right. So
that it'll be easier to do it by yourself online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for now, there's a direct link to get the hat. It's the basic hat. It's the trucker style or whatever you call it. What do they call those?
The original Richardson hat.
Richardson hats.
Yeah.
Our signature hat that we sent out for the limited edition 33.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
boxes.
what's there now.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, if you want to get fancy, call them up and tell them what you want.
They have all kinds of products, beanies and shirts and polos. So if you want something else besides the hat, all you have to do is go to the website, to our website, find the link for the hat, and then that will take you to their website, and then you can just find their email on there. They've got to contact us at the bottom of the page. Send them an email and say, hey, I want the Brothers of the Serpent logo on this product that you have. And they'll handle it. And we'll...
So what?
Right.
Yeah, they're called So What.
Yeah.
That's EW.
They have two shops, though. One's the embroidery shop where the machine is, and then one's in Fredericksburg where it's a retail shop.
Yeah.
And we've landed on the retail shop website. But anyway, it's all the same family. There's also a Laura working there.
That's right.
All the Lauras are holding it down for all the Snake Force stuff. And it's good. So I'm very proud to bring that to you guys. I'd been promising. I worked hard over the summer to bring you Christmas early in the summer for all those people who got in on the limited edition order.
Yeah.
And now here we are.
Yep.
You can just click and get.
That's right.
So.
All right, we got some one-up boxes.
Before we move on,
tell
us your best joke. That's not a joke.
That's not a joke.
Tell us your best joke. Come on.
I don't think he knows any jokes.
He doesn't
He
know
knows some
any
good jokes, guys. He really knows some good ones.
I don't know any good ones.
You don't know any good ones?
We'll have to teach you some good ones so you can joke on demand.
All right, this first one is from David Getson. We had him on the show. He did
He's got a note right there.
Yeah, and he got me a corncob pipe.
Oh my gosh,
Look at this thing.
That's the most awesome corncob pipe I've ever seen.
Yeah, dude. There's a note in here.
Crazy.
Yeah, it says, a gift for you. Hello, Russ. It only seemed appropriate that my discovery of how the hygrometric properties of this pipe play out came while listening to your GMA sode on Tesla. Happy holidays and enjoy, from David.
Awesome.
Hydrometric properties of this pipe. All right. This is a good one. Thanks, buddy. I really
Thank you,
appreciate
buddy.
that.
Thank
Yeah.
you, David. I've been keeping up with David and Dana on their Instagram, and they're doing
right.
well.
And now we have
now,
this gigantic box.
this gigantic box from the one and only Anne to Russ. It's gift Russ day.
Yeah, this is all for me.
Yeah, everything's for Russ today.
Okay.
There's a little more.
There's a note. Let's see. Hi, Russ. You mentioned a few times in early shows sharing your tower with a very large cat. So maybe you have the warm and fuzzy category covered. But there was yarn and a carton from which the neighbor's cats had consumed all of their crunchies and a pattern called something magic. Well, joking aside, you seem to have created something magic for a lot of people. This design may look slightly familiar if you tilt your head and squint. You may also notice the place where my brain wandered off and I did not math. I don't feel at all bad about leaving it because I was probably listening to you at the time. Thank you for not having answers and for making room for people who cannot believe the stories. All the best always, from Anne. P.S. The original design, which I modified a bit, is by someone Mockingbird from the Netherlands. Yeah, go ahead and try to say that one. Yeah, I didn't even try.
It's a nice lasagna box.
Yes, this note is written on a lasagna box.
And it's got Christmas teddy bears
Yes,
on
it's
it.
very wrapped. What's that?
That's the pattern
Oh,
that
this
she
is the
gives.
pattern? Okay.
I'm familiar with this. I've opened up one of these
Oh,
before.
man, this is a blankie.
Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
What?
Russ got his own blankie.
Yay!
Look at that. That's beautiful. I'm going to find the place where you did math. And I'm going to point it out to everyone. But right now, it looks flawless. That's beautiful.
Wow.
It's beautiful, Anne. Thank you so much. We enjoy getting blankets from you.
Yeah.
I was so excited when I opened it. You know, I'm the
I
official
wish
gift
I could
prepper.
make something like that.
Well, we'll have to send you up to Miss Anne and get a couple lessons.
So I have to. All the mention of the cat was making me think she made something for the cat. So I take it I'm not supposed to let the cat sleep on this.
Well, there was balls of yarn involved and a lasagna box.
Okay.
Yeah, but we don't want kitty
can we
claws.
say Garfield?
for-
Garfield, yeah, okay. All right.
Okay.
No, that's beautiful.
Soul, can you tell the Snake Force that you love them?
He doesn't say things on command.
Okay. He usually does. He's my kid. I've got experience with
Normally, he's never quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell him you love him, buddy.
this. Watch Mama. I love you, Snake Force.
Say it.
All right. Well,
All right,
you guys
get
have
out of
a
here,
good
kid.
show.
You're bothering me.
There
We're
you
going to
go.
go in there and play. We'll see you later.
All right, see y'all later. All right, what was the deal?
Well, first, let's make sure I got this right. And Anne's note, the design is by somebody named Eneki Muijenkind, which is
Okay.
probably still not how you say it, but it's definitely not Mockingbird.
Oh,
That was
okay.
me not being able to read her cursive, which
Oh.
looks beautiful, but I can't read. Most of the notes she wrote in very large, very easy to read, childlike letters that was definitely written for me to be able to read it.
Okay.
But then at the end, she signs it and then writes the PS in cursive, and I'm just like, shit. So it's not Mockingbird on the
She's
envelope.
messing with you, man.
Yeah, on the envelope she sent it. The name is Ineke, and then Muijenkind, Mooijenkind. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's the design, and it's beautiful. And yeah, so I have lots of interesting stories, many that were sent by contributors to the show, listeners and stuff. But first, let's go ahead and do space weather news from spaceweather.com. If I can find it. I just had it. Here it is. Updated storm forecast. A CME is coming, and it could hit Earth's magnetic field within the next 12 hours. New modeling by NOAA focuses attention on December 10th as the date of greatest geomagnetic activity, specifically between the hours of 2100 UT and 2359 UT, when storm levels could reach Category G3. These are unfortunately daylight hours in the USA, but prime time for aurora viewing in Europe. Activity could continue through the night of December 10th and 11th, giving North Americans north of latitude 45 or 50 degrees a chance to see auroras. Also, the Great Conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn are converging for a rare Great Conjunction. At closest approach on December 21st, they'll be just a tenth of a degree apart. So close that some people may perceive them as a single star.
Wow.
Jupiter and Saturn have a close encounter every 20 years, but usually the conjunction is difficult to see because it happens too close to the sun. 2020 is different. The giant planets are drawing together in plain view during evening twilight. The last time they were super close and easy to see was in the year 1226. So this is a rare event indeed. Dates of special interest during the Great Conjunction of 2020 include December 16th and 17th, when the crescent moon passes the planets, and December 21st, when Saturn will be as close to Jupiter as some of Jupiter's moons. So enjoy the show. And what's interesting to me that they don't mention here is that what makes this even more rare is it's taking place on the solstice.
Yeah.
Right? So so the last time they were super close and easy to see was in 1226. But when was the last time they were super close, easy to see, and it was happening on one of the solstices or even an equinox?
Right. Man, Saturn's going to be as close as one of its moons?
Apparently. Apparently.
Okay.
Like, if you're looking at...
like,
I know, yeah, like, wait a minute. That doesn't sound right. No. Like from the perspective of Earth, Saturn will appear to be within some of the moon orbits of Jupiter.
Right.
Yeah. But no.
I was not how is this happening?
How is this taking place? Velikovsky was right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Oh, my God.
Okay, so
the other thing was like, man, some of Jupiter's moons are way out there.
Oh, right. Yeah. Saturn is just a small moon of Jupiter. Current conditions, solar wind speed is 464.7 kilometers per second. The density is 7.1 protons per cubic centimeter. Current sunspot number is 11. And we are at currently 206 days total in 2020 with no sunspots. That equals 60%. And the neutron count right now is 9% above, which is rated as high. And it says it's changed it's gone up 0.7% in the past 48 hours. And the new metric we've got here, the KP index right now is rated as quiet 2. But the 24-hour max is at 3, which is still rated as quiet. So I had this we were talking about how we're going to dig into this KP index thing.
Yeah.
So there's multiple levels of digging into the KP index. One is what people think that it does in terms of perception or maybe psychic abilities. The first thing I want to dig into, though, first is what is it?
Right.
Like, in other words, what is the index? What does it mean? And how are they measuring it? And what are they measuring?
Right.
So that's the first thing we're going to look at here. So this is from spaceweatherlive.com. This is their article on the KP index. So it says, the KP index is the global geomagnetic activity index that is based on 3-hour measurements from ground-based magnetometers around the world. Each station is calibrated according to its latitude and reports a certain K measurement depending on the geomagnetic activity measured at the location of the magnetometer. The K index itself is a 3-hour-long quasi-logarithmic local index of the geomagnetic activity at the given location and time compared to a calm day curve. The magnetometer measures the maximum deviation of the horizontal component of the magnetic field at the location of the magnetometer.
Okay.
And then it reports this. So the global KP index is then determined with an algorithm that puts the reported K values of every station all together. So the KP index ranges from 0 to 9, where a value of 0 means that there is very little geomagnetic activity, and a value of 9 means extreme geomagnetic storming. So what it's measuring is the horizontal fluctuation of the geomagnetic field of the Earth. That's what I was thinking last time. I was like, the index is not, it's about how much the field is fluctuating
yeah.
due to solar activity,
Right.
usually is the cause, right?
Right. So when the number is low, there's little solar
There's very
activity.
little fluctuation in the geomagnetic field of Earth, which usually correlates to low solar activity.
Okay. So it's not the other way around, which is what we were discussing, the possibility that it was the other way around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. That makes it all like, because what Soraya was saying was when the KP index is high, when there's a lot of solar activity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But somebody else had written us saying that when it was, I think they were saying that when it's low, there was some, this is why I was confused.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So we still have to figure that out. But moving on here, the estimated 3-hour planetary KP index. Okay. So this measurement is a preliminary KP index derived at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center using minute-by-minute data from a number of ground-based magnetometers that relay data in near real time. These observatories are located in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia. This estimated 3-hour planetary KP index gives us a quick indication of the strongest observed geomagnetic activity over a 3-hour period. And the periods are from midnight to 3 in the morning, from 3 in the morning to 6 in the morning, and so on. The maximum positive and negative deviations during this 3-hour period are added together to determine the total maximum fluctuation. These maximum deviations may occur anytime during the 3-hour period. So during periods with high geomagnetic activity, the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center will send out alerts based on this near real-time minute-by-minute data as soon as a certain alert threshold, which is KP4 or higher, has been reached. And then they have some tables here showing you what measurements they were getting on days that were rated as quiet, and then what measurements they were getting on days with minor storms, moderate storms, and severe storms, what the cycles were. There's a whole bunch of stuff on here. So the KP index, let's see, the finalized KP index comes from the GFZ in Potsdam in Germany and is updated twice a month. These are the official finalized KP values for scientific research. This index is slightly different from the preliminary. Unlike the preliminary index, this finalized KP data is expressed on a scale of thirds and has 28 values, where the preliminary KP index only has 10. So the KP value we're giving from spaceweather.com is the 10 on the 10 scale. And they're doing the one on they have both the 24-hour recent and then the current up-to-date 3-hour reading, or the most recent 3-hour reading. So they give it, because these fluctuations can be slow, they give it a 3-hour time, and then they look at what data is coming out from the sensor, and they measure the highest movement and the lowest movement horizontally, and then they, and then that's what they rate the index as.
Okay. So yeah, there was some big storm happening on the sun that they were seeing a couple of days ago, and they're like, it's going to be coming around, and that's what you were reporting on.
Yeah, that there's a CME on the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that may cause the KP index to go up.
To jump up, yeah.
So spaceweather.com is not giving a prediction. There are places where you can get predicted KP values. Space Weather, the Space Weather metrics I'm reading is giving us the current value and the most recent 24-hour value.
Right.
So if you're interested in predictions so you can plan out your meditations and psychic stuff, then you're going to need to go to a prediction place.
Yeah, we're giving you a once a week
snapshot of what's happening right when we're doing the podcast. That's right. Let's see. There's a couple things about changing the values and how they've fine-tuned this measurement system. Okay, and then this one says the NOAA uses a 5-level system called the G scale to indicate the severity of both observed and predicted geomagnetic activity. This scale is used to give a quick indication of the severity of a geomagnetic storm. The scale ranges from G1 to G5, with G1 being the lowest level and G5 being the highest. Conditions below storm level are labeled as G0, but this value is not commonly used. Every level has a certain KP value associated with it. This ranges from G1 for a KP value of 5 to G5 for a KP value of 9.
Okay.
We often use this G scale on the website, so it's wise to familiar yourself with it. And then they talk about what KP values are necessary to see auroras in certain locations. And this was sort of in the space weather story we read too.
Right.
Any location on the high latitudes will be able to see auroras within a KP of 4. For any location in the middle latitudes, a KP value of 7 is required, and the low latitudes need KP values of 8 or 9. The KP value that you need, of course, depends on where you are located on Earth. So we made a handy list, which is a good guide for what KP value you need for any given location. Yeah, so they have a list of where, like, if the KP is at 1, where can you see auroras? You know, and basically,
Right.
it's if at 1, you need to be in Alaska.
Yeah.
But if it's at, let's see, 9, you can see them in Mexico and Miami.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Or in Europe, you can see them in Barcelona or in Rome. Australia, you could see it in Brisbane. Yeah, Cape Town, South Africa. So yeah, close to the equator. Basically, if it's at 9, which is a really rare thing,
Right.
And also you might have other problems if there's a 9.
That's right.
Okay, so that's the KP update there.
All right. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So I think the main thing to take away, besides all the way the system works and the measurement system, it's good to know, what are the tools they're using, what are the time scales, what are the frequencies they're looking at. The main thing we need to understand is the KP is a measurement of fluctuation in the geomagnetic field.
Right.
That's the basic idea. And the system is like 0 is no fluctuation, 9 is a lot. Right.
Right.
So
And that fluctuating field is what a static field doesn't induce current into a conductor.
right. So a highly fluctuating field causes electronic problems.
Right, because it induces currents into conductors everywhere that are within that fluctuating field.
Right, which is why it makes sense to me on the one hand to say that if we're going back to how does this affect, subtle abilities or psychic abilities or whatever, or parapsychology. On the one hand, I would say that a calm field seems good because you're not causing interference in your whatever you're using to do your psychic stuff. But on the other hand, if the requirement to do stuff like that is that a field is being induced in your brain or whatever, then you need a fluctuating field.
Yeah. And especially one that reaches out and passes a bunch of other brains.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I still need to find out which one it is. But there's conflicting, like you said, Soraya talked about.
And I seem to remember that from Dr. Schock's book too.
Yeah, that
It's talking about high solar activity, because
Right.
that was what the book was basically focused on, is high solar activity.
Yeah, and high solar activity.
And this would be another thing, is like looking at really good conductors like gold, and you look at all these weird Egyptian carvings of them holding things that are radiating stuff. And
Yeah.
okay, so if you're getting gold and you have this KP index of 9 is on the reg,
Yeah.
then metals like gold may have very interesting, maybe doing interesting things. They may just have electricity.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know how much, but
Right.
that would be interesting to find out.
Yeah. And I'm sure the watcher would say that if you put mercury in there somehow.
Yeah, of course, and spin it.
And then you would say, well, based on cymatics, that something else. Like, what is, I was wondering this, like, what do I always talk about? Watcher always wants to add
Blenders.
mercury. Yeah, okay. Watcher always wants to add mercury to everything. You always want to correlate everything to cymatics. And I just think everything is a blender. Okay. Now I'm glad we got that settled. That's right. Blenders. God. Okay.
But that would be really cool, is if there was heightened solar activity, and you had this the fluctuating field where it was fluctuating enough to where if you could build things, you could design things with metal in such a way that it would just be a power plant, right?
Yeah.
You set it up in a way that where it's these currents are being induced, and then you're somehow tuning them to each other, and then you're increasing the voltage based on the design.
Yeah. And imagine these same kind of fluctuations taking place deep in the past when the Earth had like a magnetic field that was an order of
Much
magnitude stronger than it is now.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. That's cool.
Yeah. Okay.
And then that makes me think about giant slabs of mica in pyramids down in Mexico.
Yeah, the big, very good insulators.
And I wonder where the best position to be for conductivity in that fluctuating field. Would it be nearer the equator or up towards the poles?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
But anyway.
I mean, is it
cool.
easier to fluctuate a magnetic field near its poles?
That's
or-
what I don't know. I don't know.
It seems like it would be easier to fluctuate it in the middle of the flow rather than where the poles are.
Right, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah. So maybe we can dig into that more and find out, like,
But typically with a transformer, you line them up to where the poles are parallel with each other.
Yeah.
And one is inducing a current into the other,
Yeah.
right? And it's on this, so you put the two poles parallel to each other, and you get them close enough to where the field of one is going down through the poles of the field of what would be the field of the other one.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
Well, we have some listener communications. The first one here is a comment on episode 175, which was Soraya's mechanism. This one's also from Anne. She says, about sensing frequencies. Monster Quest tried to use laser measuring devices on 3 different animals. The Humboldt squid, the Greenland shark, and a crocodile. And each time the animal took off when the laser touched it. So that's interesting. Like, could they sense it or did they see it? You know, there's like the laser dot lands on their body and then like pew, and takes off.
yeah. Yep. I mean, or that's weird with the crocodile too, because
Yeah.
they got a pretty hard.
Yeah, it's
Exterior,
scaly.
yeah, scaly,
I mean, sharks are also scaled. Both of them have scales. Shark scales are just really tiny, but yeah. All right, this one's from Mike. Or Mick, I don't know. It says, great show, guys. I have been to Egypt twice. Last time we had the pyramid alone after hours. Found the Queen's Chamber full of pallets. About 10 by 10 by 10 feet full of electronic equipment and rows of what looked like amplifiers.
Oh, I wonder if
He says that was in April of 2017. So I wonder if
that was Robert Walter.
yeah, or the Scanned Pyramids guys.
Oh, it could have been them.
Yeah. He says, we also got to go to the crypt, the last 150 feet on your hands and knees. Also have been to Peru, and your pyramid work is amazing, but Carmen Bolter's work on the pyramid code would really fill a big hole in your work as she goes into the metaphysical aspects. Also, Hugh Newman and his megalithic work would fill in nicely with all the rabbit holes you guys have gone down. Also, a great job in avoiding political stuff. From Mike.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I think didn't Hugh Newman co-authored a book with Jim Vieira?
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Yeah, on the Giants, and
Yep.
then I have watched the Pyramid Code. I don't know that.
Yeah,
I
both of us
finished
have
it.
watched that. Yeah.
I can't remember
It's
if
a
I
good
finished
one.
the whole series, but
Yep.
yeah, that's really good.
Okay, this one is from Derek, but he also says, insert disposable alias here. He says, hi, Snake Bros. Great podcast. I started listening to it after hearing you on Where Did the Road Go a while back. I wanted to work my way through the back catalog before I commented, so I've been cherry picking episodes that really sounded awesome to listen to. Problem is, They all sound awesome. So I'm not making as quick of progress as I was planning. You know, I have things that I have to do other than just listen to podcasts all day. Thanks a lot, jerks. So I guess I'm not just going to be able to catch up before commenting. I just got through episode 105 and noticed that Kyle said that one of your weak areas is genetics. The Watcher seems to have a pretty good grasp on the subject, but if you have any questions, my background is in population genetics, and I would be happy to help, unless you have gotten more proficient since then. I see you have a deep dive in around 50 episodes from where I am, so I'm guessing maybe you found help. So I might have more comments later. Now for some various comments that have accumulated in my brain up to this point. I'm going to reorganize these for show purposes here. So he is on the subject of teeth wear. If cows and sheep are pasturing in an area with horsetails, which are plants, they have been known to wear down their teeth due to high levels of silicates in those plants. Also on teeth, it's been suggested that smaller teeth are adaptive in humans as we cook our food, so it's easier to consume, and we don't need them taking up space and getting in the way of things like talking. And the last one here is my only complaint thus far is that in the Sign of the Seal episode, you had several Indiana Jones references, but you never brought up snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? If I had any skill with audio manipulation, I would make a clip inserting bros, preferably yelled, after each time Indiana Jones says snakes. Snake bros. Why did it have to be snake bros?
That's a great idea.
That's all for now. Time to continue my trek through the archives. Keep on slithering. Insert disposable alias here. But let's go back, because this other one he had, the first one he actually listed, he says, I want to test Russ's compendium of weird sites. Do you know of anything in the western Iowa/eastern Nebraska area? So 2 things. Number 1, that's a little too fine-tuned. I can give you Iowa and Nebraska, but I'm not going to be going like, sort of western, maybe a little bit northeastern, maybe only down this particular highway kind of thing. But I'll tell you some stuff that I know about in that. And the other thing is that sadly right now, my computer is completely down and has been for weeks. So I don't actually have access to the archive that I have of weird sites. But I do have a couple of suggestions for you. Okay, so in Iowa, there's an ice cave. Apparently, this cave sits on top of a glacier, and it stays frozen all year. So you should go check that out.
That's cool.
Yeah, so you're going to have to take notes here because I didn't mark down where these are. I just know the names of them. There's also the Fossil and Prairie Park. This has Denovian fossils, marine fossils, and lots of interesting stuff. And then you can apparently find the fossils and take them home if you find them.
Oh.
And then there's this place called the Grotto of the Redemption, which you should definitely check out.
Dun, dun, dun.
It looks really interesting and strange. Yeah. In Nebraska, there's a Toadstool Geological Park. This place is full of really cool geology, so you should go look at that. The Hudson Meng Bison Kill is a cool place to go check out. I'm not sure how big this is, but basically a rancher was doing something like digging a cellar or something, and he found in just thousands of bison bones buried in the ground.
Wow.
And they're kind of all preserved in the, where they were. So you can go take a look at that. And then there's also Carhenge. You should go look at that too. Somebody built a Stonehenge out of old cars.
Yes.
So there you go. Sorry I don't have the archive, but because the archive...
And it's aligned to the equinox.
The archive has a lot more interesting, like, archaeological and geological sites, but those are just some you can check out, and if they're near your area or you're willing to make the drive. So, but yeah, thanks for asking, man, and appreciate the email. And yes, genetics is still our weak point.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna respond to. Is like, nope, haven't figured it all out yet.
Nope.
So.
Yeah. I think maybe what you might be looking at are the 3 episodes we did on hybridization, maybe?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Evolution and hybridization. So you're probably going to think we got everything wrong in those shows, which is fine. So write us and tell us what you think. But yeah, we had a lot of fun on those episodes, and we definitely determined that we still don't understand genetics. And the watcher who does understand genetics, as much as anybody can, still had his mind blown by some of the hybridization stuff. So good episodes. Okay,
But
so
yeah, by the time he gets here, he'll have already listened to that. So
right. That's right. He'll probably have already written us about those episodes before he hears us responding to this email. Unless he's listening to the recent ones at the same time. All right, well, I have more stuff, but we're out of time, so I save this for a future episode. We've got, that's most of the emails, but we have one from Roddy, but I want to give that one some time to talk about from Roddy the Mammal.
all right.
And we've got some contributions that came with articles that are really good, so I'll be reading those on future episodes.
All right, good
right,
deal.
yeah.
And up and coming is our interview with Laird Scranton.
It's the future us's again.
What's up, dude?
We have traveled back in time from the end of the interview. Just to give you guys a quick heads up, we had a lot of fun talking to Laird, but there was a bit of a lag. So be aware of that when you're listening to it. Sometimes there's a little bit of hesitance, and it's just because of the lag in the internet connection. But
I interrupted him the most.
yeah, it made it tough to interrupt him, but we still tried. All right. Enjoy the interview.
All right, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are glad to welcome back Laird Scranton to the show. After finishing our deep dive into his book, The Velikovsky Heresies. So, welcome back, Laird. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. We're thinking of this as the best pandemic ever. We're doing everything we can, to make it the best pandemic ever.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard. I don't know if you heard that Jimmy Church had been sick with COVID-19 for the last week, and he posted a fairly long statement of how much he does not wish this on anybody. He is sick as a dog.
Oh man,
not hospitalized, but sleeping like 20 hours a day trying to beat it.
Yeah. We had some close friends catch it, and they got really sick as well.
yeah.
So-
And then we've had some other friends that all that happened was they lost their sense of taste and sense of smell for
Yeah.
a while,
Yep.
and otherwise not
Right,
really
and
many
some people who walk around with no symptoms at all, but still test positive.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the main topic, I think, today is, since we finished our deep dive into your book, The Velikovsky Heresies, I want to talk to you about that book. As we went through it, Kyle and I had long discussions on many of the points you made in there. And I mean, just the premise of the book, first of all, I want to say the premise of the book is fantastic. I love the idea of taking this work that's, 50 years old at this point or more and saying, all right, it's 70 years and let's look at what modern science has to say, and does any of it refute Velikovsky's ideas, or does it work with Velikovsky's ideas? So how did you come up with this idea? Let's talk about the genesis of the book in your mind and how you just decided to work on it.
Okay, I went to high school in Portland, Oregon, and Portland back in Velikovsky's day had been one of the seats of support, college level, university level support for Velikovsky at the time his book came out. So I knew Velikovsky's name. I had a sense of what he had written about and the controversy and so forth. And as the years progressed, I kept being more and more confused about how is it that this has not resolved yet. There should be some fact that we can point to that tips the controversy, either in his favor or against him, but there has to be some absolute unquestionable fact that we could point to that would do that. And so the premise of the book was to try to find that. And I came at it with no preconceptions. I wanted to deal with, I wanted to work from reputable scientific sources to the extent that I could, preferably sources that had no axe to grind with Velikovsky for or against him, and preferably things that had not been available when he was writing.
Right.
And so he died in the early 1970s. I was writing, this book was published in 2012. So roughly, half a century later and more, there had been a whole lot of science published, and a lot of intimate information about Mars and about Venus in particular. A lot of work done on exosolar system studies. A lot of work on the history of the Earth's effects that have happened on the Earth geologically and so forth over time. And so I just started working from those. But the idea was to step through Velikovsky's premise for the birth of Venus, stage by stage, and examine what he says and examine what critics have complained about, and try to see how do we reconcile those two against the new science. And what I ended up finding was that at every stage of the process, there are a handful of considerations that if Velikovsky's right, those considerations all evaporate. If he's wrong, science is left with this half dozen number of points that it somehow has to come up with special explanation for it. And when I was a student, my teachers taught me that was the hallmark of a theory that's probably right, not one that's probably wrong. And it happens at every stage of this thing. If we're looking at Venus as a planet, if we're looking at historical events that happened at 1500 BC or at 709, 750 roughly BC, or if we're looking at reports about Venus historically up through to the era of the 1960s, by well-known observers. If we're talking about the birth of Venus from Jupiter, is there a perspective that would allow what Velikovsky said happened to have happened? Or if we're talking about impact with Mars, does the damage on Mars anyway conform to what Velikovsky said it ought to? So all these different ways of looking at this thing, and just trying to put a reasonable test on all of it. That was the idea. And then I approached my publisher, Inner Traditions. I said, look, this is the idea I have for a book. If I wrote it, would you publish it? And their acquisitions editor wrote me back and said, we, for a long time, wanted to publish a book on Velikovsky, but we didn't have any material to publish. So absolutely, go ahead and write it.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, and they, by the way, Inner Traditions was very good with us.
That's the way the book came about.
Okay, yeah, and I just wanted to say that Inner Traditions was awesome in this process because we like you asked us to talk to them before we did the book report, and we did, and they worked with us. So I think they're a great publisher. So we always recommend that people.
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think they are too. They have a very talented staff.
Yeah.
And I've always found them very easy to work with. I have no problem recommending an author that an author work with them. It's a pretty good group as publishers go.
Yeah.
They've been around for a long time. They've been around for 40, 45 years.
Yep. That's right. And we were in the town where they're based and forgot to go to their office and say hi. Yeah. Still feel dumb about that.
Well, the town where they're based in Rochester, Vermont, is mostly sort of a wide space between mountains, low mountains.
And our
enough space to set a town square, and that's about it.
That's right. Our uncle lives there, and we were there for a whole week visiting him, and we were hanging out in that town square eating sandwiches, and their office is like right there across the street, and we forgot to go say hi. It's just, yeah. So one question, one part of the book that I wanted to go through with you a little bit is the stuff about the calendar changes. So there's a whole long section in the book about ancient civilizations or ancient peoples suddenly changing their calendars from 360 day to 365 day. And the one part that we didn't quite dive into very much was the connection to the Dogon and the ancient Egyptians and how you correlated that with what the ancient Egyptian calendars looked like. So can you take us through that a little bit, like the Dogon calendars and how they correlate and how they apply to this argument that Velikovsky was making about calendar changes?
Okay, one of the principles I use for my own work, anytime I'm dealing with any kind of an interpretation, in the end, I want to bring it down to being able to finish a simple sentence. The sentence is, we know this must be true because, and fill in the blank. And if you can't finish that sentence in a way that is intuitively reasonable to somebody, then you don't really have anything. So there's been a lot of controversy about the Egyptian calendars, whether the 360-day calendar was a ceremonial calendar, as is traditionally thought, or whether it was feasible to think that in ancient times there might actually have been a 360-day year, because there are all sorts of civilizations all around the planet that observed a 360-day year for more than 1,000 years. Now, in order to tackle that, I thought the best way to get at it was the Egyptian calendar, because we know an awful lot about Egyptian calendars. And so I approached my friend, the late John Anthony West, and I asked him to pose a question to the Egyptian scholars he works with, who are authorities on the Egyptian calendar. These are the go-to people for the Egyptian calendar. And the question I asked was, what single factor compels us to believe that the ancient Egyptians had a 365-day year in ancient times? What they came back to me with was, in every case, it was equivocal evidence. It was evidence that could be taken one way or taken the other. The traditional view is that ancient Egypt had a solar calendar from fairly early times in Egyptian culture, and they know that because of an inscription that indicates that the solar year began with the heliacal rising of Sirius, and that's an event that happens once every solar year for the Earth. If they were judging that as the start of the year, then that calendar had to be formulated on an actual solar year, a physical solar year. What they don't say is how long the solar year was that New Year's rising of Sirius marked. When they give the evidence, they give the evidence in terms of numbers of months and numbers of days. And the problem is this, that the names of the months of the lunar calendar were the same as the names of the months of the solar calendar. So when they express things in terms of the 12 months and the number of days, it's not immediately clear whether they're talking about the sum total of the days of the lunar calendar plus 5 days, the 5 sort of leap year days that they used to adjust the calendar, or whether they were talking about the solar months of the year plus 5 leap year days. One way, you get a 360-day civil year that's being reconciled to a 365-day physical year. The other way, counting New Year's Day, you're getting a 355-day lunar year that's being reconciled to a 360-day physical year.
Right.
Now, in most cultures that made use of leap year days like that, what they were doing was they were reconciling a lunar calendar to a solar calendar. They weren't reconciling a ceremonial calendar to a solar calendar. So it would be in the ballpark of the general thinking worldwide that the Egyptians would have been trying to do that second thing, reconciling a 355-day lunar year cycle to a 360-day solar cycle. So then I started exploring, when's our first evidence of a calendar year that's documented to be 365-day year? Velikovsky talks about an event that happened around 750 BC. We can refine that timing a little bit. There are factors that show that the event he's talking about happened at 709 BC. Some truly strange effects were produced by whatever that event was at 709 BC. The first thing is every total eclipse of the sun that has happened since 709 BC can be retrospectively confirmed to the date and the place where it happened using computer calculations, which makes sense because if the motions of the sun and the earth and the moon are run like a clock, then it's simple mathematics to sort of rewind the clock back to where that eclipse had to have happened, and they can track it. The problem is that not a single total eclipse of the sun prior to 709 BC in any culture, reported in any culture, and there were 40 some of these reported just in China alone, not a single one of those can be confirmed to the date and the place that it happened using those same calculations. And what that means is if we can't hit those total eclipses of the sun as sort of anchor points for our perspective, prior to 709 BC, we have no genuine perspective on where the stars were in relation to us. They might have been situated any which way. So that's the first indicator that something really big on a cosmic scale, sort of a solar system level scale, must have happened at 709 BC.
Yeah.
The second thing is that same boundary has all sorts of other odd connections. Radiometric dating doesn't work across that boundary. Somehow there was a major change in the rate at which ions are absorbed by plants, which is what radiometric dating is based on. And so they have to use fudge factors when they're doing carbon dating and other kinds of radiometric dating to arrive at a date that's prior to 709 BC. There was a major unexplained fluctuation in the magnetic pole of the Earth that happened right at that boundary. That boundary marks one of the two most volcanic eras that we know about geologically on the Earth for reasons they can't explain. It's reflected in ice cores and things like that. We can see it reflected in tree rings that they count. They're all different ways of measuring this. We noticed that just after 709 BC, we saw mass migrations of many different tribal groups southward in Germany, let's say. We saw changes in climate in China such that crops that had been grown there for 1,000 years couldn't be grown there anymore, couldn't be cultivated there anymore. It looks like there was major climate change. In the era immediately following 709 BC, suddenly all of these cultures around the world decide, independently of each other, to switch from a 360-day calendar that they had long observed to a 365-day calendar. In China, the perspective is that they had a 365-day calendar long before 709 BC. The problem is that nobody documented it textually until well after 709 BC. So there was a method for calculating the length of the year, but since it wasn't documented until after 709 BC, we can't be sure they weren't documenting the current length of a year, not the length in ancient times.
Right. So
the net of all that is that there is a reasonable perspective from which the same major event that caused these unexplained effects that we see reflected in the Earth and the geology and so forth was large enough to have the potential to have perhaps shifted the orbital path of the Earth just enough to make a 5-day difference in the length of the year.
Yeah, that was clear in the book. And I think all of that's all sort of what I was talking about, but I'm also interested in the Dogon connection. Like you were including in the part about Egypt, specifically about the Dogon calendar and how, because the Dogon seemed to be a reflection of very ancient Egypt, what their calendar practices were, also tell us something interesting. Is that right?
I'm not immediately clear on what you're referring to. Let's see.
Yeah, that's fine. If there was a whole section in there about the Dogon calendar and how it correlated.
The Dogon do have they do observe the same calendars that the ancient Egyptians did. There's a set of a half dozen or more different calendars that the Dogon preserve. One of them is an agricultural calendar that resets at the time of the harvest. Another is a solar calendar that resets with the heliacal rising of Sirius. That's a cosmologically based beginning to the year. They have a number of other calendars also. but because the Dogon have a 360-day calendar, or one of their calendars is a 360-day calendar, and they don't really observe it in the same. They can't be said to observe it in the same ceremonial ways that the Egyptians did. It looks like it might be a remnant of a previous calendar. It could be reasonable given the whole mindset of the way units of measure were developed in ancient times, that there actually had been a 360-day year and a 30-day month originally.
Right.
Which seems a little precious, but that's what's indicated, because all of the major units of measure of time, the 30-day month and the 360-day year, the 60-minute hour, all of these units of measure, the 12-month year, things like that, are all even factors of a grand cycle of precession, which is traditionally figured at 25,920 years.
Right.
So it would be in the mindset of all of that. It would fit very neatly in the mindset of that if, in fact, the Earth had experienced a 360-day year originally and a 30-day month. But it's hard to imagine that happening by chance. We can imagine, based on some of the symbolic references and some of the scientific information that's included in the Dogon system, that someone very, very capable was behind the symbolic system. The question is, could they have been capable enough to have arranged those kinds of dynamics on the level, at the level of orbital path of a planet or orbital period of a moon?
Right. I mean, it could be maybe not specifically by chance, but, we talk about resonance a lot on our podcast. Kyle is, as an audio guy, is always thinking in terms of waves and how they affect things around them. And it does seem that a lot of these numbers that involve the precessional cycle, that, if they're adjusted a tiny bit, like, the 360-day year, the 30-day month, that all of these things seem to fall in line with a kind of resonance in some very large cyclical resonating system. So it may not be by chance if it was like that. And
that could be.
Yeah, and then it seems like that if that's the case, and I know this is speculation, but if that's the case, it would seem that whatever took place in 709 BC, or whatever has happened that changed that system so that now we have a 365.24 day year, and that kind of puts everything out of whack, out of resonance, right? It's out of balance.
Right. And actually, there's an Egyptian myth that talks about the moon having lost a percentage of its days to the sun.
That's right.
Yeah, the 5 days.
The
One
month having shortened and the year having lengthened.
Yeah, no, that was really cool, because the 5 days that the moon lost were 1/72nd of the moon's days.
That's right. That's right.
That was really cool. I was like, hey, man, there's precessional numbers right there.
Yep.
That's right. That's right. So you're right that dynamics of energy are regular enough that they potentially could explain why these orbital periods, so forth, fall out the way they do. We know that the orbits of electrons around an atom fall into predictable proportions to each other,
right?
In terms of numbers of electrons per shell and distances of those shells from the center of the atom and so forth.
Yeah. So this brings up another question that this is more specifically about Velikovsky's ideas. But since we're talking to you about Velikovsky, I figure you're the guy to ask, right? So the idea of what's it called? Is it Bode's law or Bode's theorem? The idea that the planets are all in a sort of, they're all in predictable distances away from the sun.
Right. Yeah.
So
right,
if Venus wasn't there, then what happens to that resonance system? Does the whole solar system have to sort of fluctuate a little bit to adjust for the loss of Venus, and then it has to fluctuate again for the arrival of Venus? Or do you think?
Well, okay. First off, we have to understand that I get this directly from Jeff Marcy, who was for a long period of time the head of Berkeley's Search for Earth-like Planets.
Okay.
The two competing theories we have for how rocky planets form, both depend on a primordial cloud of sort of dust that surrounded the sun after it formed. The one says that that dust sort of clumped together to form the planets. The other is that some of that material was drawn off by another passing body, like another passing star, and sort of created droplets that created the planet. The problem is that neither of those theories hold water anymore, according to Marcy. The reason they don't hold water anymore is because, based on all the studies they've done of these exosolar systems, they realize, okay, the traditional view is that rocky planets, it's understood that rocky planets form in the range of time between 10 million years and 20 million years of the life of a star. And it's also traditionally understood that they form from that primordial cloud. The exosolar system scientists, the astronomers, now realize, having looked at all these different systems, that that primordial cloud largely dissipates by the end of 10 million years. It's not there to create the planets in the time frame that the planets are thought to form. So there has to be another mechanism. And so the accepted view among the exosolar astronomers, which they have not publicized very loudly, is that gas giants form in the first 10 million years, and the rocky planets form in the next 10 million years, largely as a result of collisions among the gas giants. In other words, we're seeing a perspective on the formation of rocky planets that's exactly in the ballpark of Velikovsky, except they haven't publicized it.
Right.
So Velikovsky's view for the birth of Venus is entirely a reasonable one based on what we know about exosolar systems. Beyond that, they've also found examples in these exosolar systems. One example where two Earth-like planets were formed by a collision, the splitting essentially of a gas giant. So we know that that's possible. The second thing is they found examples of newly formed planets with comet-like tails, which is what Velikovsky describes.
That's right.
We know that these gas giants, the gas giants are treated like pristine samples of that primordial cloud material. So anything that could have been formed from the primordial cloud could also theoretically be formed from a gas giant like Jupiter or Saturn or one of those.
Right.
Yeah. And that all makes sense. The question I still have, though, is about the distances of the orbits of the planets from the sun. I guess the question then would be, do these exoplanet researchers still think that system holds, that there is a mathematical prediction that you can make of how far planets will be in their orbits away from the sun as you go out?
Yeah, I think the harmonics sort of insist on certain distances. And I think they understand that that's true. But if you have a solar system where 10 million years into it, you're seeing lots of collisions or occasional collisions between planets or other bodies, then you've got bodies roaming around all sorts of places that they shouldn't be until it all settles back down.
Right.
So by definition, you have a system that's not harmonically placed to begin with.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
So
it seems like the view of these cosmologists or the what do you call it, the dynamics of solar system mechanics is kind of a lot like the uniformitarian geology view, where everything has to happen really slowly and there's no crazy catastrophes. That's kind of what it seems like to me. Their skepticism on some wild event like what Velikovsky is suggesting is based on this idea that everything's pretty normal or slow moving all the time.
Yeah, or that any very violent events like Velikovsky was suggesting
now,
only happened really long time ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, exploring what Velikovsky said about Venus impacting Mars, I came across a study by Caltech, out of Caltech. They had run any number of computer scenarios to try to explain the damage they see to the surface, to the crust of Mars. And they concluded that what they see could be explained by a single impact by a planet-sized body millions of years ago.
Right.
So I reached out and I contacted one of the researchers on the team that produced that study and said, on what basis are we saying that it happened millions of years ago? And she wrote back and said, well, everyone knows that we haven't had astronomical bodies roaming the solar system since millions of years ago that could have done that.
Right.
In other words, it's a self-fulfilling view.
Right.
And the reason why it couldn't have been a recent impact is because we've all agreed there couldn't be a recent impact.
Yeah, it's nothing about the specifics of the geology on the planet that tells you that it's millions of years old. It's
Right. It's
just
just
because
that
they
that's-
know that there hasn't been anything like that for millions of years.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
So one of the other
The same thing happens with Venus. I mean, oh, go ahead.
Oh well, I was kind of changing subjects a little bit, going back to the Chinese and their calendar. There was a part in the book that was interesting about the Chinese had written about an eclipse that happened.
Yes.
And
that's right.
the people looking at it were saying, I guess the archaeologists or whoever it was that was looking at what they had written about were looking at their models and saying, no, an eclipse didn't happen. But then right after that, they say an eclipse happened at that time, but it was in Antarctica.
Or it was in the Arctic Sea.
Or in the Arctic Sea. So the question was, were the Chinese specifically stating that they saw the eclipse? Or were they recording it based on figuring out like their mathematics or whatever and not having experienced it? Because that's really strange. Either
Well,
our models are
Chinese-
right and they were in the Arctic Sea witnessing this eclipse, or they figured out that it was happening even though they didn't witness it, or they actually witnessed it in China.
And our models now show it in the Arctic, which can't be right. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, we have a special situation between China and Korea in terms of ancient astronomy, in that they've been able to synchronize the notations and the recordings of both societies with each other. They have timelines that line up with each other, so they can, when the Chinese are reporting a particular odd event, and in the same moment, the Koreans are reporting the same thing, and so they have two different perspectives, sort of corroborating testimony on what was seen. The next thing is that there's lots of indication that the tilt of the Earth has changed over time. And I'll give you an example that's not in the Velikovsky book, but this is pretty much carved in stone. We have recorded changes in the angle of tilt of the axis of the Earth. And where we have it is in Malta. The way it presents is, on Malta, there are three sets of megalithic structures that were built. But at each of the three locations, there were also two reconstructions, three incarnations of that same temple built in parallel with each other in the three locations, starting at around 4000 BC or maybe a little bit before that. Now, these structures are very interesting because they have a round back and they have a narrow opening at the front. A narrow opening at the front that has the potential to function like the lens of a camera.
Yes.
There's an engineer from Malta named C.R. Sant, whose viewpoint is that the purpose of that narrow opening at the front of the structure was to focus the image of the sun on the back wall of the temple, and they could track its motions day by day by day by day. They had a perfect calendar there of the motions of the sun.
That's cool.
But for that configuration to work, the aperture has to be a particular number of degrees opening that relates to the latitude of where it's built. If we were going to build one today at the equator, the aperture would have to be 23.5 degrees, which is the tilt of the axis of the Earth. The aperture required gets somewhat larger as you move north from there, until you reach a point in latitude going north from there where you can no longer effectively build the kind of structure. It doesn't work anymore. The aperture is too wide open for the lensing effect to work. So the problem is that these three sets of structures in parallel with each other record different changes in the sizes of these apertures required at the latitude of Malta, which implies that Malta was no longer at the same latitude. This huge undertaking to build this megalithic building wouldn't have functioned properly if the aperture wasn't right for the latitude. So we can say with a lot of confidence, because of those structures, that during that period of time, we were seeing changes in tilts of the axis of the Earth. That part of the urgency for building those large structures was they wanted as much forewarning as they possibly could get that kind of an event was starting to happen, because there are very bad potential effects that accrue from it.
Yeah, and this would be an axial shift of the Earth. This is what you're talking about that Velikovsky mentioned.
Yeah, this could be a magnetically induced change in the tilt of the axis of the Earth. We might be about to go through one right now. The fluctuations we're seeing in the magnetic field of the Earth, there's the possibility that when the magnetic field shifts, that there could be an automatic effect on the alignment of the planet. We're not sure that there wouldn't be. Or it could be that the close approach of a body to the Earth that has its own magnetic field would have the potential to essentially roll the Earth on its axis. If we look at, let's say, ice ages, one of the inconsistencies about an ice age is that North America sees an ice age when Europe doesn't. What you're actually seeing are opposite sides of the globe glaciated at the same time, which implies to me that some region moved to the globe, to the pole of the globe that wasn't there before.
Right.
And that region and its opposite side of the globe experience ice ages at the same moment. And that after a period of time, it shifts again. If you look at a globe of the Earth, you can see large indent spaces like at the Gulf of Mexico and at Hudson's Bay moving northward that give the impression of a place where an ice cap might have been. And if you look to the opposite side of the planet, you can find similar indentations on the other side.
Oh, opposite of those particular.
It could well be geological structures, right?
Yeah, okay.
Although right now, we don't really have that kind of an ice cap in the same way at the North Pole that we do at the South Pole.
Right.
But so it's perfectly thinkable that the Chinese and the Koreans might have reported an eclipse of the sun in their era with the Earth aligned in a particular way that we can no longer confirm. If it happened before 709 BC, it's flatly true. We can't confirm it.
Yeah. The problem that brings up is that, people use this program Stellarium and they rewind the clock 12,000 years ago to try to look at, alignments or whatever. Like, think about the Orion correlation. That would make all of those values incorrect once you go back to 4,000 BC, if this happened then, or, and the other.
That's right. That's true. That's right.
Sorry, the other part of that would be looking at the pyramid.
That's one of the reasons.
The way it's aligned to north, would change. So I don't know.
No, the pyramid is a different concern. The pyramid is aligned to geographic north.
Right.
Yeah. It's very precisely aligned to north, south, east, and west geographically. Change the tilt of the axis, and you don't change that alignment of the pyramid to north. That's right.
Okay, I got you. We're not changing the actual. We're not rolling the crust over and the axis staying the same. It's the entire axis is changing, so it's still that's still cardinal north.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Right, and that's also evidence that Hapgood couldn't have been right about the shifting of the crust over the top of the Earth, because unless we believe that in the 5,000 years at least since the pyramids were built, that the crust hasn't shifted enough to put the pyramid out of alignment.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's right.
That doesn't make sense to me.
Right. So you're not talking about
a crustal shift.
A crustal shift. It's when the axis. So that's what I guess I don't understand is how, if the axis shifts, would we have ice caps in different places, or would they still be at the poles?
Yes, because where the ice cap is determined by the land's relationship to sunlight. the sun shines most directly at whatever part of the planet is situated at the equinox, and the equinox doesn't really change. With minor changes in tilt of the axis, the equinox point doesn't change. But depending on how the tilt of the axis is, if suddenly what's now at Antarctica is shifted to where Brazil is, we're not going to have an ice cap there anymore. We're going to have an ice cap somewhere beyond Antarctica.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it still was.
Now that kind of a rule in the tilt of the axis of the planet could theoretically happen without catastrophic destruction on the Earth. There would be large effects, but not nearly as large as if we shifted the entire crust of the Earth around.
Right.
Yeah.
Or not nearly as large as if we somehow changed the rotational speed of the Earth.
Yeah.
Something like that would require so much energy and generate so much heat that there would be terrible consequences.
Yeah, and the oceans would roll out of their basins and over the continents, and I mean it would be crazy if you change the spin in either direction. It would be very catastrophic. But yeah, I could see that you could shift the axis a bit, especially if you did it magnetically. Right. Where it wouldn't be.
But even with just that, we see some pretty incredible effects. There are entire islands north of Siberia that are comprised entirely of the intermingled bones of extinct animals.
That's right.
That's insane.
Some huge wave of water swept across the planet and swept up all these different kinds of animals and deposited them in these spots.
That's right. And we another deep dive we did a while back was on Velikovsky's book Earth in Upheaval. And he just outlines that kind of stuff all through that book. And, the caves and cracks and crevices in England and in various places in Europe that are just crammed full of animal bones all smashed together. Evidences of enormous amounts of water carrying things across, rolling over forests and picking up trees and animals and then jamming them into caves and to where they're still preserved today. Yeah. Yeah, but so going back to this Chinese, the eclipse, it was just interesting. I think what Kyle was trying to point out too is that it's just, it was interesting to us how you were basically quoting this guy in your book. You were like, okay, so here's what this scholar says, and this scholar is looking at these Chinese bamboo records, and this scholar is
bamboo annals.
Yes, and this scholar is saying, well, they recorded a solar eclipse in this year on this day. And this eclipse did not take place. But then later he admits that it did take place. It just seems to have taken place in that year, on that day, but it was only visible in the Arctic Sea. Now, it was obvious, it was clear to us that your point was, could this indicate an axial change of the Earth, which would put the eclipse, like if we're trying to calculate it from today and we're just rolling it backwards, it'd put the eclipse in the Arctic Sea, whereas back then, it was in China, but to us, it was interesting on what these standard model people must think of this, because he was like, well, this must be fraudulent, basically, is what he said. And it's weird because you're like, okay, so they made a fraudulent eclipse report, but they got the day and the year correct.
Right. Also, the historians consider those reports to have enough credibility that they base all of their historical timelines on them.
Right. Yeah.
So the historians take them as actual, fact, unquestionable fact, and the astronomers are saying, well, it can't be fact.
Right. That's right.
So the other thing I'm curious about, or I guess, I don't know, incredulous about, I guess, is more like, why isn't there at least one cosmologist or some physicist that would just take these ideas? Okay, they'll do this with experiments that they'll say, well, we come up with some theory and let's see if we can prove it wrong or whatever, or they make an observation on that they did not expect, right? And they're like, the probability of that is so incredibly low, but it happened, so let's try to figure out how it happened. I want one of these guys to do that with this idea, like something came out of Jupiter and then cruised around the solar system and wreaked havoc everywhere and then settled into an orbit. Why can't they just try to figure out how this could take place?
Because in the field of astronomy, it is professional suicide to lend any credence publicly to Velikovsky. Velikovsky is the crackpot's crackpot. And unfortunately, since he wrote, the entire trend of new astronomical facts that are being reported, there hardly a week goes by that something isn't reported that doesn't support Velikovsky. Probably the most heretical claim he made, according to his closest friends who were astronomers, was trying to argue that they were going to discover water on the moon.
Oh, yeah, and that just happened. They discovered liquid water on the moon in the sunlit parts of the moon.
Right.
Yeah.
Jeez. Well, actually, they're now saying that it's in the soil, that if you get enough of the soil together, that there's enough. Right. Same thing on Mars, that Velikovsky says where they're going to discover that there's water, possibly even liquid water on Mars, and there is.
That's right.
It's frustrating, man. We talk a lot about how they use this argument of probability to argue against all these things that they don't want to look at. But it's like in the same breath they'll tell you how improbable it is that the entire universe exists in the first place. And it's like, okay, so improbability is not really a way you should go about making an argument about something.
Right, especially something that happened that's already taken place, right? I think probability is okay if you're trying to predict the future. But if it's already happened, you can't sit around wasting your time calculating how totally improbable it was when it took place.
Right, that's right. If I'm walking down a path in the woods and I trip over a rock and I fall over a ledge into a river and I'm swept downstream and over a waterfall and happen to land in some miraculous way that saves my life, you can't then go back and calculate the probability of that sequence of events happening. It happened. Probability does not work in retrospect.
Right. I mean, you could calculate the probability of it, but you couldn't say, see how improbable this is, therefore it didn't take place. That's the part that they do that's really annoying.
Also, the thing that people miss is that literally every insight that Einstein came up with was the product of qualitative exploration, not quantitative. That Einstein did what he called thought experiments, to sort out what must be true about certain dynamics of energy and dynamics of physics and so forth based on simple observations. And then from that, he formulated his theory, and then he had the math guys validate it. Math wasn't his starting point.
Yeah.
In the Dogon perspective, the same thing is true, and I'll explain to you why math is not the way to go. From the perspective of the cosmology, the ancient cosmology that I'm working with, the essential factor that is shifting over time is the rate that events happen. It's the speed of the time frame of time. That time is slowing down. To make that intuitively more clear to you, the astronomers look out with their telescopes at the expanding universe, and they do their calculations, and they say, from what we can tell, the rate of expansion of the universe is speeding up. We can't explain it. We need we've missed dark energy, some factor that's accelerating the expansion rate of the universe. From the Dogon perspective, that's all hogwash. What's happening is they're seeing the effect of their own slowing time frame. Just like if you were happen to be riding on a train next to another train on the next track, moving at the same speed, and now one of the trains changes speed. It's not immediately clear to you whether your train slowed down or the other train sped up, because it's a relative perspective. It's this difference in time frame that makes the difference. Now, if we use math to define that or to explore that, we reach a point looking back in time where we we hit zero or we hit infinity looking the other direction. We hit a point where we're either forced to divide by zero, which math can't do, or we're forced to divide into infinity, which math can't do. If we're talking qualitatively, we can say, as has been measured, that entangled particles, the effects between two entangled electrons happen 10,000 times as fast as they do for unentangled. That's a factor of quickness of time frame, not a factor of anything else. The ancient perspective is, at the time of the Big Bang, which looks like a singularity to us, time was running 1,000,000 times quicker than it is now. If you express things in terms of quickness of time frame, you never hit that divide by zero problem. You never hit that infinity problem. It's all relative to what your perspective happens to be. It's a much more workable approach to understanding what's really going on with things, and that's the approach that the Dogon take and the approach that these comparative traditions take in trying to describe things. Even the geometry of the alignment geometry for an aligned shrine, like a stupa. The tool they gave the ancient students to use to measure this geometry out was the cubit. Well, the cubit is related to body parts. It's either related, it's defined by the length of a person's forearm, or it's defined by the average pace or step they take. That changes, that differs from person to person. Buddhism doesn't care, because what they're concerned about are the effects that accrue from the relationship of the figures, not how big the figures are to 5 decimal positions. It doesn't matter what unit you use to measure it, as long as you're using a consistent unit. So that's just a factor to keep in mind, is with probability, is that math may not be the ideal way to go in trying to sort out answers to these questions, even though the scientists think it is.
Well, good, because that's one thing I'm really not very good at, is math. But I love the idea of the time speeding up and slowing down, and trying to wrap my brain around that is also fun. But I'm curious what your thought is on the perspective of a person. So right now, I don't feel like time is running any slower than it was years and years ago. And so I'm curious, as like, if we could go back to the early part of the universe where time was traveling a million times faster,
It would seem normal.
would it seem just normal?
It might seem normal. Yeah, it might just seem normal.
It might just seem normal.
It might just seem normal. Now, you might be familiar with an Egyptian concept called Mat.
Yes.
Mat is a complicated idea. Different people interpret it different ways. It's sometimes expressed as the concept of truth or justice,
Yep.
or as some kind of an ideal principle. But every Egyptian word, through the glyphs that are used to write the word, flatly tell us the intended meaning behind the word. And the root word of Mat is a word called Ma. And the glyphs of the word Ma read, perception is the foundation of measure.
Right.
Now, to give you an example of how the system works, our outlook, you remember back in a long time ago, in the days of the ancient Greeks or whenever, we believed that people thought that the Earth went around the sun went around the Earth. The Earth was fixed and the sun rotated around the Earth. That was a common perspective. It took a particular insight on someone's part to figure out that you could see the same effect, but describe it in a different way, that in fact maybe the Earth was orbiting around the sun and rotating on its axis. It was not immediately intuitive that was what the case was. Well, our perspective is that we're living in a universe that is expanding, that spaces are getting larger and larger and larger and larger. In the ancient perspective, that's not at all what's going on. What's happening is time frame is slowing down. We can tell from entanglement of particles that under the covers, you can't have the kind of immediacy of interaction between two particles separated by hundreds of miles if they're really separated by hundreds of miles. That under the covers, they must actually be situated somewhere much closer to each other than that, and it just seems to us that it's hundreds of miles. And the way the perspective works is this, that the speed of light is a constant. It doesn't matter what our frame of reference is, no matter how much we're accelerating or whatever, the speed of light is always going to be measured as a constant in relation to us. What that means is that if I measure the distance light travels in a second today, and let's say years from now, it takes twice as long for a second to actually happen, light is going to travel twice the distance during that second than it used to, because the speed of light is constant. Now, the effect of that is sort of the same as if someone snuck into your bedroom in the middle of the night and revamped everything so that all the distances between objects in your room were proportional to what they had been before. But now you wake up in the morning and it looks to you as if the room has expanded by twice its size. I guess that's not a perfect analogy, but that's what's happening with the universe is.
But it does take you twice as long to get to those things.
That's right.
They're messing with our basic frame of reference. Another way to get at the idea is, I was thinking, I live 3 hours drive from New York City. Depending on how I tried to get there, it might take me differing lengths of time to do it. If I was going to walk there, it would take me much longer. If I was going to ride a bike, it would take me less time than if I walk, but more time than if I drive. If I drive, I can get there in 3 hours. If I took a train, I might be able to get there in less time. If I took a plane, I might be able to get there in less time. If I took a jet plane, I might be able to get there in even less time. If I linked my PC through Zoom to New York City, I get there instantly. None of those modes of communication between the two places changes the real distance between them. It only changes our outside perspective on what the distance seems like it is. There was a famous report out of by some anthropologists on an island, I think in the Pacific. There was a tribal group that had always lived between two mountains on this island in the Pacific. And the anthropologists took some of the tribal group members outside of the valley they lived in, and for the first time ever in the memory of their culture, someone could view sheep on the top of the mountain sitting in a distance. The anthropologists could not convince the people, those tribes people, that they weren't looking at tiny sheep. They didn't have a sense of perspective. What's happening is, under the covers, time frame is progressively slowing. When we look at things from that perspective, all sorts of mysteries of science, all of the quirkiness of the quantum domain and all sorts of other things evaporate the way that the Velikovsky concerns evaporate at each stage of his theory, if he's right. That time frame slowing down is the missing element that explains all sorts of things that we don't understand. It's not space that is expanding. It's our own frame of reference that's slowing down.
Yeah, and so I understand what you're saying there with the light and it being a constant. What always throws me for a loop when I start trying to think of this is, because we're talking about the speed of light, and I'm always like, well, velocity equals distance over time, right? And so, right. But if light speed is a constant, then it isn't a velocity that equals distance over time. Because the time changing, the light will just, if time is seeming to move slower, the light actually continues to move the same amount. It just, to us, looks like it's moving farther, which is it's just a weird thing in my mind,
right. That's right. It's a perspective thing. Another way to get at it is, I'm sure you've seen some of the perspective films were done back in the 50s or since that time, where they build they use these effects on with musical performances on places like Saturday Night Live, where they build a room so that to the outside observer it looks as if a person standing on the left side of the room is much, much taller than they really are, and the person who then walks across to the right side of the room looks like they shrink as they go, because they've messed with the perspective of the proportions.
Yeah.
Same thing with the famous dance routine where they rotate the room and it looks like the dancer is dancing on the walls and the ceiling.
Yes.
They're messing with perspective to make us think that. An even simpler way to understand it is to simply cross your index and middle fingers and run a pencil or a pen up and down between the two fingers. Your brain will imagine that there are two pencils.
Whoa. Wait a minute.
I gotta try this.
I gotta try that.
All right, we're gonna have to do a Snake Bros experiment after the show and see how this works.
Well, going back to the Velikovsky Heresies, another question I had was about the correlation between Venus and the birth of Venus and the goddess and Pallas Athena. You mentioned this in the book, but you didn't go too deeply into it. You were saying that, one of the arguments that casual students of mythology had with Velikovsky was that it wasn't Venus who was born from Zeus, it was Athena, right?
The goddess. Right. The thing is that most modern students of Greek mythology don't understand that Athena is not the same goddess as Pallas Athena. And Pallas Athena is expressly equated with Venus. Athena isn't.
Okay, I didn't know that. Those are two different goddesses then.
Right. And Velikovsky says it's very easy to predict which goddess in the mythology of any ancient culture represents Venus. It's the goddess who's born into the mythology.
Right. Okay, so that's the connection I was needing to make was how do we connect Athena to Venus? And you're saying, no, it's Pallas Athena, which is a different person, a different goddess.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right, that makes that clear. What other questions do we have here?
The other one was about the other calendar change.
Oh yeah, so there were a couple of cultures that you listed in the book. You had a big list of so here are some cultures who, not a complete list, but here's a list of cultures who changed their calendars from 360 to 365.
Right.
Two of those, and this is interesting to me, but two of those, the Inca, I think, and the Romans, were not around in 750 BC. If they had a calendar change, it was way later. So what do you think the reason for that would have been? Is it because they inherited an older tradition and they had to adjust it, or is there an explanation for that?
That could be. I don't have an explanation for why that might be. The most likely thing is that they were descended from a tradition that celebrated a 360-day year, and they reached a point in their scientific perspective where they could now measure the actual length of the year and realize, hey, that's not right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I figured too. Both of those cultures seem to have inherited much older traditions, so it seems like
right.
They might eventually change it.
Now, the measuring of the length of the year is really not a difficult thing. From around 4000 BC on, there are any number of cultures who were doing it quite simply, a very simple technique for doing it. They needed it for agriculture because it makes a difference when you plant seeds to grow them, and it makes a difference when you harvest them. And to be able to do that, you have to have a sense of calendar, a sense of seasons, and so forth, and a way to accurately measure how the seasons are changing. The technique that was used is most obviously observed on Orkney Island at around 3200 BC. There are the earliest megalithic sites in the United Kingdom. One of them is called the Standing Stones of Stennis. And that site is situated in clear view of two mountains across an expanse of water. There's an island called the Island of Hoy. And there are two mountains there that to an imaginative eye look like two sleeping elephants. And the mountains end up creating a gap in between, like a valley between the two of them. And the way the dynamics of the geography work, the sun sets directly between the two mountains on the equinox. And from Stennis, or actually more specifically from a pillar known as the Watchstone, you can observe the seasonal motions of the sun against the backdrop of those mountains. You can watch it move progressively further north and progressively further south. At Elephantine Island in Egypt at around 4000 BC, the group there was doing the same thing in relation to a mountain that looks like a single reclining elephant. And the effect is so evident that I've even come up with text references from people who live in Elephantine in modern times who say, by the way, we can tell that it must be just about summertime based on where the sun rises against that mountain.
Yeah.
The same thing was true on Malta from these sites I was talking about. At one of them called Hagar Quim, they have sort of a megalithic window set up with two stones that frames an island that looks like sort of a squared reclining elephant. And the same effect is evident there. They can watch the sun rise and set in relation to that mountain and observe the motion of it left and right. This is one of the reasons why I know that the megalithic structures that were there to track the motions of the sun couldn't have had primarily an agricultural purpose, because nobody needed to set up megalithic stones. That was a huge amount of work for the sake of agriculture, when they could just watch the sun rise and set behind the island a short distance away.
Yep.
Now, we actually even know there's a relationship between Hagar Quim and Orkney, because Hagar Quim in the Maltese language means standing stones. On Orkney, an ancient name for Orkney that nobody has etymology for was Orkneyjar. Well, in the Faroese language, which is one of the ancient languages of the Orkney region, Orca means to endure or to stand, and Kajarni means stones. So Orkneyjar also means standing stones, only in a different language.
Yeah, we've often talked about that too. The standard idea is that they built these crazy megalithic stone structures so that they knew when to plant. And it's just like, you don't. No. All you need is a stick in the dirt, or
That's right.
or
There's a lot simpler ways to do it.
Yeah, a distant geological feature that you can see from your perspective where the sun is in its motion. So, yeah,
at Abydos at around 3000 BC, a couple hundred years after the Orkney era, or into the Orkney era, the ancient Egyptians, first dynasty Egyptians, established a cemetery in direct view of two mountains that are like the Orkney Mountains at Abydos. And according to Seti, the original name of that site was Abdu, and Abdu meant the desired mountain. So the site was actually named in honor of the mountain that the sun sets in the same way, same relationship as it does on Orkney. And you have the same effect happen everywhere. When 1,500 years later, when Akhenaten was relocating his capital to Akhetaten, he set it in view of two similar mountains where the sun rose in the gap between the two mountains. And he set a pillar to watch it from. All the way up to the Hebrides Islands to the west of England, you find site after site after site where they have deliberately set large stones in place to be able to mark and observe where the sun rose or set against similar mountains.
Yep.
You even have the same effect as early as Göbekli Tepe at 9000 BC. I have photographs of the sun either rising or setting, a direct view of one of those from the backside of one of those enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, rising against mountains or setting against mountains in that same relationship.
Yeah, so these megalithic structures are indications of advanced astronomy, basically. Like, they're actually working on the details of the year and other aspects of astronomy, not just so that they know when to farm, how to farm.
Right. And actually it may go beyond that. There are reasons to think, good reasons to think, we all understand that a lot of the stones used at these sites have energetic properties.
Right.
Ultimately, the perspective cosmologically in the ancient tradition is of these shifting time frames. Okay, you imagine over 12,000 year half cycle of the Yuga that, okay, in the perspective of the root philosophy here called Samkhya, universes form in pairs, and there's a cycle of energy and mass between those two universes, that the net effect of that is to progressively make one universe less massive, and so its time frame quickens, and the other universe more massive, so its time frame slows. That's we can envision that in terms of an hourglass with all the sand at first in the top globe, and that filters down into the bottom globe. But at the center of the cycle, which would have been around 3600 BC, the center of the half cycle of the Yuga, the amount of sand in the top globe is equal to the amount of sand in the bottom globe, which means the time frames of the universes should have equalized. And at that point, it's at that point that the Dogon are saying that their teachers, who they say were originally non-material, were able to cross over to the material side and take action on our behalf materially.
Yes, we talked about that last time we had you on the show. That is a really fascinating concept. I love that. So the megalithic structures are portals, perhaps, or just way.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
So you can imagine. So you can imagine that at 3600 BC, it didn't take a whole lot of energy to hold that kind of a portal open.
Right.
But
Oh, man, that's
that as
cool.
time progressed and the differential in time between the two universes started to shift more and more and more, perhaps it took a larger and larger amount of energy to hold that kind of a portal open. And so we see these increasing size stones and increasing size structures being built with increasingly energetic properties, like the Great Pyramid is probably the extreme example. There's a perspective from which there might have been a purpose to that structure involved with holding that portal open.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Well, this brings me to some questions from our listeners for you. And you already segued into the kind of question he was asking, but he wanted to, so regarding this material/immaterial cycle, he wants to know, how long do the cycles take? And as we ascend towards the immaterial, is this something that everyone can feel, or is it something that only the most spiritual or shaman type people would feel?
If we believe that I have reason to believe, how can I say this? There are a number of different estimates of the length of the Yuga cycle, depending on what source you listen to. The one I like is 25,920 years.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I like it is because of the relationship to all these units of measure. It's completely in the mindset of whoever put the system together to do that.
Yes.
Take the largest observable cycle and then use factors of that to represent things.
Okay. All right.
Also,
That's cool.
I subscribe to that because of the way events play out in the last 12,000 to 13,000 years. It looks as if the dynamics of that cycle are at work. From that perspective, we've just now passed bottom of the cycle. We've just passed the point where we're the most material that we would ever be, and we're now starting to become less material. And that may be why we're seeing all sorts of odd new energetic effects. Astronomers are reporting them almost weekly, things they can't explain happening energetically. A second form of light they didn't realize existed, and all sorts of weird things, emissions of energy. They look back, they reported last week, I think, that they have an example of a black hole billions of years ago that was spitting out stars at a furious pace, much, much quicker than anybody ever thought stars could be produced. Well, from my point of view, that's a factor of a slowing time frame. Looking back at it, it looks like it's happening too fast. Okay, so the cycle is roughly a 13,000 year cycle. In the era that we're in right now, we know that there are some people who seem more connected to things, energetic things, than others. Some who seem more connected to paranormal and shamanic type effects than others. So it looks like there's a natural propensity that is in some people that's not in other people. But we also have reports, there's every reason to think that a lot of the reports of the fairy tradition out of the Celtic world that happened for millennia, over the course of millennia, might have represented real effects from the perspective I'm talking about, that there might have actually been any number of different kinds of creatures who had sort of a quasi-material existence, or the ability to move in and out of material existence.
Yeah.
There were reports that we get in the 1600s and in the 1500s and in the 1400s. Each generation is saying, you know, my grandparents' generation was far more sensitive to this stuff than I am. They were far more convinced that this fairy tradition was objectively real. Whereas from our perspective, we're starting to have our doubts because we don't see it the same way they did.
Yeah. It's
So
due to
my
the
guess
rise
is
in
that
science.
humanity as a whole. Yeah. My guess is that humanity as a whole has a shift in consciousness that tends to draw us all more into perception with things non-material, but that individuals have greater or less capacity in each of those contexts to be sensitive to it.
Right. So we would all eventually come to sense it, but there are some people who are like sort of leading the charge or are better at it than most other people. Just like everything else, people have talents.
Right. Just like everything else. That's
Yeah.
right. Just like anything else you can think of.
Yeah. All right, good. And then, okay, so another question here. Is it Skara Bray? Is that how you say that? Is it Skara Bray?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so this guy is asking, do
Depends
you...
on whether you want to say it with local accent or not.
Yeah, how do you do it with a local accent?
Scarborough.
So yeah, regarding Skara Bray, do you believe the culture there had ties to Göbekli Tepe?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I just self-published a book that traces that.
Ah,
The problem on Orkney is they have a number of foundational elements there that they know were there from the beginning, or they're pretty sure were there from the beginning. They're unique to Orkney in the United Kingdom. When they pick, some of those are agricultural elements, some are domesticated animals, some relate to architecture, some relate to language, some relate to things like pottery. There are a number of different clusters of these elements. The problem is that researchers there will pick any one of those elements and they'll say, well, you know, this same element exists in any number of places in Europe, so we can't be sure where it came from. Or there are other elements that'll say, we know through DNA testing this couldn't possibly have come from anywhere nearby here. It had to come from a distance, but we don't know where from a distance. That approach to trying to trace the origins of the original Orkney farmers doesn't work because any single element doesn't bring you to an answer that's objectively true, or they can demonstrate to be objectively true. However, what you have there are these distinct clusters of elements that all have the same origination point. They all originate at before 6000 BC in the region of the Fertile Crescent, which is the region of Göbekli Tepe. There's also a breed of mouse on Orkney called the Orkney vole that they've done DNA testing on. They haven't been able to find any exact matches in nearby Europe. But I know that the breed of 6-grain barley that they have on Orkney originated in the Near East before 6000 BC. I know that the Orkney sheep, the Ronaldsay sheep, is an ancient breed that originated in the Fertile Crescent before 6000 BC. So from my point of view, I wondered whether they had tested this mouse, this vole, genetically against similar mice from the region of the Near East. And I discovered that the gentleman who did the testing happened to be a researcher at SUNY Albany, which is right up the street from where I live. So I contacted him. And he said, no, they didn't go that far afield in their testing. They limited it to nearby locations in Europe. So I found a candidate vole in the Near East, and I found maps of what its modern-day habitat is. And the modern-day habitat extends down into Palestine. It jumps over to the tip of North Africa, and it extends up through Turkey, a little bit into Eastern Europe. I also found maps. Okay, mice become a surrogate for archaeologists and anthropologists for inferring where people went, because mice tend not to stray very far from where the people are. They'll stay close by. So anywhere you find the mouse, you find the people. So if you know where the mice go, you know where the people went. So I found maps that tracked the various migrations of these mice outward from the Near East. And I see that they all move across the Mediterranean out to parts western from there in Europe by various pathways across the Mediterranean. So using that as my guide, I wrote a book that tracks, it's called Tracing Orkney's Origins, that tracks these clusters of elements side by side with each other across the major islands in the Mediterranean to Malta, and then on up the Hebrides to Orkney on a coherent time frame. Now the interesting thing is that the researchers in the Mediterranean can see their official perspective is that in places like Crete, it's clear to them that someone deliberately colonized Crete for agriculture. There's no history of Neolithic anything prior to the Neolithic in population on Crete. The first people who came there hit the ground with a set of elements that suited them to agriculture. They ended up not surviving there immediately. There's a second round of colonization that happened later. But when they first arrived there, they arrived with these clusters of elements prepared to try to establish themselves as farmers on Crete. The official perspective of the researchers there in the Mediterranean is someone was deliberately colonizing major islands for agriculture. Well, the signature elements that we see on Orkney at around 3600 BC are almost a perfect match for the set of elements we have on Malta in about 100 years earlier or less. The perspective is there are linguistic and symbolic perspectives in addition to these agricultural elements that make it look as if a group of students, initiates of this esoteric tradition from Crete that were way pre-Minoan, received education in the cosmology on Malta, and then when they graduated, opted to move up to Orkney. They made their way slowly by sea up to Orkney and established an educational tradition on Orkney using all the same elements that it had on Malta. And we see that most immediately because all of the original houses at the Skara village are built with architecture that for the Dogon represents the image of a sleeping goddess or a sleeping woman. That sleeping goddess theme first becomes popularized in Malta.
Yeah.
That's the site we relate it to. Now on Malta, there's an interesting situation because the sleeping goddess figure was found inside some caverns that there have been megalithic structures put up in. These caverns have been the basis for these megalithic structures. The site is called the Hal Safliene Hypogeum. Now, one of the first researchers of that site, one of the people who found the site, wrote back in 1910, and he mentions in his pamphlet that he published on it that the name Hal Safliene Hypogeum comes from the name of the village that sits on top of the hillside or the mountain that these caves are encased in under. But he says it's a misnomer. It's really not a correct name for the site because in the Maltese language, Hal Safliene means low-lying village. So it seems incongruous that they would have named the site for a village that was sitting down on the flat, not the village that was up on the hill where you have access to it. If you go to the Faroese language in Orkney, the word hall means either cave or hall, and the word Sophie means to sleep. The word ein means one. So Hal Safliene implies hall of the sleeping one, exactly the term you would want to describe the Malta site. So you have all these linguistic connections where in Crete and in ancient Greece and other places, you have all these terms that are being bandied about in ancient times that nobody has any etymology for. They can only guess, scratch their heads and say, how did someone come up with that? You go to the Faroese language and it plays right out. You see, you combine the Faroese roots and you get a meaning for the name that is completely intuitive for the thing the name represents.
And Hall of the
So you have a mix on
Hall of the Sleeping One refers to the reclining goddess of Malta. Is that the idea? She's the sleeping one.
Right.
Wow.
She's the sleeping one. And this is a pervasive theme of the cosmology. One of the metaphors is this relates to the book of Genesis and other writings like in the Polynesian tradition with the Maori and in New Zealand and so forth. The idea that the Hebrew god or Canaanite god Yah represented the first glow of light that preceded the dawn that sort of floated over the waters and induced a sleeping goddess whose domain were those waters to open her eyes and perceive material reality. That's the concept the metaphor that's being represented.
That's really cool.
So now you have some other interesting connections to Crete and to Malta on Orkney. For one thing, the Skara Brae village overlooks a beautiful bay called the Bay of Scale. The name Scale it repeats a naming convention of the tradition. The word Sakai or Skay means to celebrate, and El is the name of a god, or actually a cosmological concept. So to me, the name Skael means celebrates El. El was a Canaanite god. It seemed, I was wondering how in the world did a Canaanite god get to Scotland? One of El's icons, actually an icon associated with El and his consort who was, Asherah, was a crown or a diadem. The myth was that El and Asherah were married to each other, and at the end of the wedding ceremony, Asherah tosses her diadem up into the sky to create a constellation called the Corona Borealis, the northern crown. The shape of that constellation very closely matches the shape of the Bay of Scale that sits next to the Skara Brae village. Now you go to Crete, and you have an island called Naxos that seems to have expressed nostalgia for Orkney the same way that Abydos did. But on Naxos, you have a bay that takes the same shape as the Bay of Scale, named Crona. Well, in the local language, Crona means crown. In the Faroese language on Orkney, you have two words for crown. One is Scali, which comes from that same Sake phonetic, but the second word is Crona, which repeats the Crete phonetic. So that's one of the indicators. I mean, normally when that happens in English, it's because you received two words from different languages that meant the same thing. You have the French word and you have the Old English word, and now you have two words, a word for beef and a word for meat, a word for beef and a word for cow. Two words that refer to the same thing, but from different languages.
Right.
So it looks as if on Orkney, you have Cretan language influences alongside cosmological terms in the Faroese language that then play out again when you go back to Crete. The Dogon perspective was initiates were educated at a remote site and then returned back to wherever they came from to teach others. And so immediately following the Orkney era, you find all sorts of architectural forms and other things appearing on Crete that hadn't been there before, but made their first appearance on Orkney, like beehive tombs and things like that. You have rock cut tombs that are very similar to a famous rock cut tomb called the Dwarfy Stone on the island of Hoy across from Orkney. So you have this sort of out and then back in effect that's happening. You're coming across the Mediterranean, up the Hebrides to Orkney, educated on Orkney, and then back to Crete as the pre-Minoans. We're told that the Minoans were the first ones to develop drainage systems. But in fact, you have a perfectly wonderful drainage system at the Skara village on Orkney 200 years, or actually more than 200 years before you see a Minoan one.
So are we tracing a civilization here from Göbekli Tepe to Malta to Skara Brae, and or is this more like a secret society, or maybe a mystical tradition, or knowledge brotherhood?
We're tracing an instructed tradition that was, from a civilizing standpoint for humanity, the focus was on skills of agriculture, and in terms of creation tradition, the focus was on scientific dynamics of creation, energetics, the dynamics of energy that produce material forms. It also produce biological forms. They produce consciousness. They're responsible for the forms of the universe. You have a handful, a cluster of dynamics of energy that are perfectly understandable, that repeat in similar form all the way up the scale from the quantum, actually before the quantum domain, on to the level of universes. The next book, the one that I'm presently involved in starting to write, deals with the very root beginnings of those dynamics of energy, down to the level of how could we possibly have had a quality of energy that naturally differentiated itself into non-material and material domains, and how did it get from there up to dynamics of energy that we recognize?
Do you think?
And how does all that relate to the Dogon symbols?
Right.
Do you think that this knowledge or whatever it was coming from, a school, do you think it's still in existence today? Is it still active in some way? Maybe
it's active with me.
Yeah, all right, yeah, great answer. But yeah, that's
no, I know. There are many groups out there that are doing what they can to try to promote this material in their own ways, and there are many different perspectives on it. I mean, any group that's teaching yoga is teaching this system. Any group that is, say, a channeling group, or a group of clairvoyant healers, all of these different perspectives on things non-material are all sort of subsets of the same material.
Right, but that's sort of like if you're teaching agriculture, you're also teaching something that this school taught, but that doesn't mean that you're part of the school. You see what I'm saying? So like if we're tracing,
right,
because it almost looks like we're tracing like a school that at least the earliest traces we see of it are Göbekli Tepe, and then they show up in various places around the world, and their teachings. So they themselves were not a civilization, but their teachings spawned civilizations.
Right, and they also spawned religious traditions we're familiar with. I mean,
yes.
The root philosophy is Samkhya in India, which is understood to be foundational to Buddhism and to Hinduism and to the Tamil tradition and to any number of religious organizations or sects that came out of that region of the world in that era. Samkhya is expressly non-theistic; it's scientifically based. But some of the later traditions that spawned were theistic, and so you have little bits and pieces of the same tradition in all those different later expressions. You have it in ancient Egypt. You have it in all the traditions I'm talking about. In Hinduism, Hinduism has express connections to Orkney. The earliest dynastic Egypt has express nostalgia for and connections to Orkney. The Minoan tradition has the same thing. There are any number of other groups. There's even the Japanese Shingon Buddhism has connections to Orkney. Buddhism has nostalgia and connections to Orkney. They sort of compulsively recreate elements that are first seen on Orkney.
So the idea then is more like at the point where the two universes connect and there can be crossovers. That's where this school began to create civilization, and now we're going through the the disconnected, the most separated part. Is supposed to be as a guide, and all these disparate ideas and things have spread throughout the world, and there's different iterations of them now. But basically, this is to guide us through the dark times, so we can get back to that. I guess that connection.
And remember that other universe exists in the first place. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
That's really cool.
And I mean, we see effects that we don't connect to the system, but from my perspective, have to be. The UFO, the whole UFO set of experiences, must relate to the tradition I'm talking about because it expresses itself through dynamics that are fundamental to this system. That there are researchers like John Mack and Bud Hopkins who were psychiatrists who one at a time would interview and take the stories of and help treat people who had been witnesses or in other ways, abductee participants or whatever of UFO contacts. These all play out in terms of images and clusters of words and clusters of ideas that are intimate to the material I'm studying. So much so that I reached out to some of the top UFO figures to try to communicate certain material to them to say, by the way, you might not know it, but these ancient dynamics relate to what you're writing about or what you're talking about or what you experienced.
That's cool. You have any more of the Discord questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're getting up on time here, but we got a few.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole bunch of questions. I'm trying to sort through them. People want to ask Laird lots of questions. Yeah. Okay. Here's a good one. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's fine. So they want Overkill. Marty wants to know what your opinion is of the expanding Earth model, and could that possibly account for some of the geological anomalies that Velikovsky discusses in his books?
Well, if our perspective is that our universe is becoming progressively more massive, then it's thinkable that the reason we saw continental shift is because the Earth expanded, not because they drifted.
Right.
And the puzzle pieces make it look as if that is what happened. If we just shrunk the Earth down, they'd fit right back together mostly.
Right, and you think that the idea of the way to explain this is because of what we were talking about earlier, the time and the difference in
the exchange of mass.
Yeah.
Right. Between the two.
Yeah, that Einstein says that if you make a domain more massive or you make an object more massive, you slow its time frame. And so if our perspective is that we have a progressive influx of mass and energy into our universe from a second universe, and there's a perspective to show that that's true, scientists know, astronomers know, and they say that in the same amount of time that it took the universe to double in volume, the ratio of mass to energy also doubled. There's a 1-to-1 correspondence between the ratio of energy to mass, or mass to energy, and the volume of the universe. That, again, is too precious to be accidental.
Right.
That it looks causative to me.
And so are we turning it around right now?
Yeah, we just reached the apex.
Are we about to start draining mass back out of our universe, and the Earth is going to get smaller again? Yes.
Well, yeah, that's a perspective. Hawking was concerned because he saw the likelihood that time is chiral. Chiral means not symmetrical. If time is not symmetrical, then you have the potential, when you reverse the flow of time, which he saw as a thing, that time you could see little messings with the timeline, little inconsistencies in the timeline going forward. I myself, my wife and I have seen numbers of circumstances that look for all the world like little shift in the timeline, not like anything else. Imagine being able to explain. Pretty much everybody I know has had a situation where an absolutely clear, objective situation that two people experience side by side with each other, and they come away from it with completely different perspectives on what happened.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And maybe the Mandela effect is
That mostly happens to married people. I'm married, so I know exactly what you're talking about, everybody.
So yes, potentially all of these things could be true. Now imagine there's a question. The botanists know that a brontosaurus shouldn't have been able to sustain its weight on the bones that it had.
right. That's right.
That simple effects of gravity should have caused the bones to break. Well, that might not be true if gravity wasn't as intense back then as it is now. If the Earth was smaller, it could have had less gravity, and maybe it was small enough an effect that a brontosaurus could support itself on its bones.
Or maybe gravity itself is part of the force that causes the exchange between these two universes. So as you approach one, there's like, I don't know where I'm going.
Gravity
with it, but
gravity itself could change.
that's why gravity seems non-polar, right? Like because the other pole is in the other universe.
Yeah.
That could be. Yep. To my point of view, gravity, the effect of gravity is these shifts in time, this slowing of time is a correlate. It's parallel to shifts in water pressure. That we know that if we take a hollow plastic ball to the bottom of a swimming pool and we let go of it, it's going to automatically gravitate to the region of least pressure. My perspective is that bodies of mass automatically gravitate to the domain of slowest time frame.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
And we're all buoyant in gravity, and we're trying to get to the center where there's the least amount of pressure.
Yeah. All right. One last question here before I have my final question. And this one is from another listener, Chip. He says, could the non-material realm provide a medium for time travel or interdimensional travel between realities?
Actually, the gateway between the domains potentially could. The reason is that it looks to me as if, Buddhism describes the geometry of how they say space actually emerges. And as a part of that geometry, you get an overlap at every point in space-time, a potential overlap between non-materiality and materiality. That overlap is comparable to a ripple that appears on the surface of water and it appears and dissipates. Energetically, it's virtual particles that are emerging and dissipating. If you can induce two electrons to interact with each other in the context of one of those spaces of overlap, all the rules, the normal rules, the familiar rules of physics break down, time in particular. Time runs ultra quickly there. We know it runs 10,000 times more quickly than it does for us. It's in that space where it seems that these superconductive effects happen, where energy is able to be transmitted with no resistance, or where we have, if you extend that idea, we have the potential to have ultra quick travel between points in a context where distance has no meaning. Now, how we would get to that, I don't know, but the ancient symbolism refers to these overlaps as gateways.
Wow. All right, man. Thank you. Those are great answers. I was looking at those questions. I was like, man, these are going to be tough. She did a fantastic job. So final thing, of course, is tell everybody how they can find you, and maybe give us before we sign off here, give us a little update on what you're doing moving forward and what you're interested in. What are you looking at for the future?
First of all, to be able to find me, probably the best place is through Facebook. I'm the only Laird Scranton on Facebook. It's pretty easy to get a hold of me there, to message me there, whatever. If what a person wants to talk about is better suited to email, I'm not against giving out my email address to someone to talk about in a more extended way about some question. I work within the traditions as a publisher through traditional publishing. That process is a slow process. It can be 18 months from the time I submit a manuscript to when the manuscript sees publication. And so I have enough material at my disposal to write about that I very often can finish and self-publish a second book in less time than that. And so for the last 3 years, what I've done is I've traditionally published one book and then self-published a second book. This year, I had a book from Inner Traditions come out called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients. The focus of that book is on various aspects of the symbolic tradition where the hand of a really capable set of teachers is revealed to us. We can see from this aspect of it that only a very capable teacher could have expressed things in this way. The second book that I just self-published is the one I was talking about. It's called Tracing Orkney's Origins.
Yeah.
And the focus there is on connecting Göbekli Tepe to Orkney at 9,000 BC to Orkney Island at 3,200, 3,600 BC. And through that process of tracing that track, we reveal all sorts of new information that was new to me about how all these ancient cultures have to interrelate to each other, which one came from which one, in what ways, what elements of this symbolic tradition emerged first in which regions, in which eras, and so forth. Was really interesting stuff for me. Both of those subjects are I was very happy to write about. The previous book I had self-published, or one of the previous books, the first book actually it's the second book I self-published, was called Seeking the Primordial. This was 2 years back. And the focus of that book was on trying to lay the foundation in ways that make sense to somebody for how this crossover between universes might happen, a scientific perspective that allows that mode of thinking. The book I'm presently working on is sort of an extension of that. It's dealing with understanding root references of the Dogon that are so deep that it wasn't immediately clear what they're referring to. I could tell they had to be referring to something significant. I just didn't have the perspective to sort out what it was. And so this book brings us down from the level of virtual particles and spinning energy that happens, waves collapsing into particles, the quantum domain. This extends us down the next level, down to the point where root energies first interact with each other, and what aspects of energy make it possible for virtual particles to even exist. Because the Dogon talk about all of that stuff. And they, when you get down to that level of discussion with any of these symbolic traditions, there's no attempt to hide anything. They are flatly telling you in the words they use what they're trying to symbolize.
Do you get attacked by the establishment for the ideas that you publish, and if so, how do you deal with that?
Not at all, because there's no traditional academic who wants to go anywhere close to the direction that this material would take them. They don't take their first step into the material. With my Tracing Orkney book, I quote a researcher from the middle whose focus is on the Near East, and he says, honestly, he doesn't know of an ancient culture that didn't make claims for instruction in ancient times by somebody more capable than them.
Right.
He then goes on to say, well, it's long past time to set all that nonsense aside.
What? What?
And I thought, what? Yeah, that's it. I mean, if you had 3 4-year-olds independently telling you the same thing, that rises to the level of corroborated testimony. If a police officer was getting descriptions of a suspect from 3 4-year-olds and they all described the same person, they'd be out looking for that person.
That's right.
Yeah. So traditional academics do not want to go there. It is a professional suicide to embrace any of that. And so I don't get criticism for anybody because what I do is completely skewed from their viewpoint.
Yeah. So.
Oh, well, I'm glad you don't have to deal with that. So.
Yeah.
we don't deal with it either. Nobody comes to our podcast complaining. Well, I guess some people do.
There's a few.
They're not academics usually.
Yeah, they're not academics. Yeah.
But thank you.
I have had certain high-level academics feeding me answers to questions as I research some of these books. I'll reach a point where, as with John Anthony West and his Egyptian language scholars, where I had a question that only a top scholar was going to be able to have a perspective on. Yeah. And I've encountered more than a handful of those who over the time have been willing to slip me information sort of under the table as an answer to a question.
Secret deals. All right, that's great, man. Hey, we really appreciate you coming back on the show, and we do another deep dive into another book. We'd love to do it again.
Yeah, any future conversations, man. It's great to have you on.
Well, great. Thank you very much for talking about my books and for having me on to discuss them. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, that was a fantastic interview with Laird, and
mind-bending.
Yes, as always. Yep. We really appreciate him coming on and answering some tough questions from both us and the listeners.
Yeah, thank you guys for throwing those questions in there. That's really
they were
cool.
great questions, and
I love the idea of being able to take the listener questions to the interview.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Let's do more of that.
Right. I wish back when I wasn't a podcaster but listened to podcasts that I could have gotten my questions to people like that,
Yeah. I think that's super cool.
Yeah.
Always forever trying to involve you in the conversation there, people.
That's right.
We love you.
That's right. Showing the same face at every inferior conjunction.
That's right.
To you, the listener. As you guys know, you can get a hold of us, brothersoftheserpent@gmail.com. Check out the website, brothersoftheserpent.com. You can find the Encyclopedia there, the glossary, the SnakeSkins, which is our merchandise store, which now has a new link for the hats. And as you heard at the beginning of the show, any other kind of clothing imaginable or other things that can be embroidered on. So they have a whole bunch of stuff, but the main link is for the hats there. But you can get pretty much whatever you want that's in their selection with the Snake Bros logo embroidered on it. And join the pyramid scheme either through Patreon or PayPal. Thanks so much to all you who have donated. We really appreciate it. And everybody who sent one-up boxes.
Yes.
It's so awesome. And your continued donations help us keep doing the show and will in the future and has already in the past help us go on trips.
Yep.
So we really appreciate that. And give us reviews at the iTunes store. That also helps spread the show around. So you can share it that way or share it any other way. Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at Snake Bros and No Vowels, SNKBRS. Join the Facebook group. Join the Discord, which is run by Jeff. And the rules in the Discord are be nice. Right? No politics, no porns, all pyramids, all the time. It's pretty easy. And thanks to History Shift for making all of our YouTube videos, buddy. We really appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
And I know you've been working hard on the past few ones because they've had actual video. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
And there may be more future ones. We'll see what's happening. And Pod Doodles continues to make awesome videos of our shows with him doodling. So if we put out a podcast on YouTube that has no video for you to watch, you can always go watch it at Pod Doodles if he's made it yet. Let's see what else. We do still have spots open for this Cablands trip. So if you're interested, and with how everything that's been happening, we've had to postpone and change and move the dates around, but now we've got another set date and there are some spots open. So if you're interested, go to contact@thecabin.com and you can get a hold of Darren there to sign up for the Scablands trip. And that would be great. So I think that's it.
Yep.
Anything else? Oh yeah, there's an archive of shows on the website.
That's right.
Got to keep remembering to mention that. So if you can't find the back episodes, just go to the website. You can find the archive there. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
We love you.
Always have.
Always will.
Good night, Adamu.
Get back to work. Did you hear the timing on that? That was great.
That was perfect.
Bow.